Welcome everyone to this edition of ROV Insights. Today, Stephen and I are going to discuss the insight that our body is an expression of our consciousness and how that relates to physical symptoms and their potential spiritual meaning in our lives. So we thought we'd both begin with some short personal stories and then about symptoms that we've had and the uh, meanings those have had for us, and then also expand that out to talk about our collective consciousness in specifically in relation to COVID and the potential spiritual meanings in that. So I'll begin with a story from my childhood. In our last ROV chat, I talked about a time when I was about 11 years old when my parents were separated and how I felt like the world was falling apart and how that gave me a real feeling of insecurity in the world and not being safe, and how that related to physical symptoms in my body. And at the same time as that was happening, I was accepted into a school in North Philadelphia. Now, the school was good, the neighborhood was pretty rough, and I had to take, and imagine this, in these days, I can't even imagine doing this. I was an 11-year-old kid, and I was taking two public buses that took me about 45 minutes total from outside the city to the inner city to North Philadelphia as an 11-year-old. Not a real safe neighborhood to go into. So, given my state of already feeling kind of unsafe and insecure in the world at that time, I took those buses every day and I walked through those neighborhoods and went to that school. Again, it was a very good school, but even, on the outside of the school, all the windows were covered with, protective wire, and there was a fence around the school and so on. And I did, on a couple of occasions, get stopped and beat up for the little bit of change that I had in my pocket as an 11-year-old. And one time I actually had my head banged on the window of with that wired window, by this kid who was trying to take my, couple quarters that I had for taking the bus. So at that time, physical symptom that happened was my vision started to get very blurry, and I started to become nearsighted. And as I look at the meaning of that and my state of consciousness, then I kind of felt like the world felt very scary out there. And so my consciousness, I kind of drew in here and kind of didn't want to see beyond my little small personal space here. And so I really believe that, because there's nothing else that happened in my life at that time physically that would have caused my eyes to start to go bad and to become nearsighted, except for those emotional events. And so it really felt like I kind of cocooned inward, and I didn't want to see what was out there because it felt really scary to me. So that's some of this idea behind how the body expresses what's happening in consciousness. And I know, Stephen, you have a similar story about your shoulders that you wanted to relate.
Yes, Kevin, and thank you. That was a really beautiful and very heartfelt story. I can definitely relate to the way that consciousness points out to us really important lessons in life through ways that we hold things inwards. And so in my own case, particularly, mine was to do with shoulders. When I was a young boy, Kevin, I played a lot of rugby, and I remember in the final of a big tournament, our team at the time came up with the undefeated champions for 3 years, and all I had to do was score this try score the final points. And if I did, it was a few minutes before time, and all I had to do was get over the corner and get a, score a touchdown or score a try in New Zealand rugby terms. And at that point, I decided I was going to do it, whatever it taked, whatever it took, whatever whatever happened to me, even if it killed me. That kind of, die hard attitude of a young, I think I was 13 or 14 at that stage. So I dived over, and the team had decided they were going to stop me, whatever it took. And so the person who was guarding that area of it, instead of trying to tackle me, actually kicked me full force in the shoulder and dislocated it. And to this day, I've got a slightly different height collarbone because of it was, so I was not clean out. I scored the try, but I don't remember what any of it. Now that actually set me up, that kind of, die hard, dogged attitude, get through and do whatever it takes kind of thing, actually went and affected me a number of times through my life. So I was in a kayaking accident, abseiling accident, wrestling accident, kung fu tournament, all to do with shoulders and all to do with the same kind of attitude. Instead of really being present to what was happening in my body. And Louise Hay says that any shoulder burden like this is you trying to carry a burden and not carrying it out joyfully. And really, it was very true. I saw all these things as something that I was going to force my way through, no matter what. I hadn't found the joy in those actions. So for years and years, including now, I've dealt with quite considerable shoulder pain. I've dislocated the shoulder about 10 times through, in those sort of events, wrestling, kung fu, abseiling, kayaking, because I did outdoor sports instructors training and ran an outdoor sports school or outdoor education school. So I had a lot of energy on those outdoor sports. I tended to go into everything with that very kind of hard head, hard shoulder, do or die kind of attitude. But really, my shoulders were pointing out to me, Kevin, that simply doesn't work. And it really opened me up to, okay, there is something that the body wisdom is really trying to point out to me. And I hadn't listened to it at that point. I'd been very disconnected, you could say, from that flow of life and energy. And it wasn't until I went to a number of different healers, many of them Chinese medical therapists and doctors, who kind of helped me see what actually the underlying cause was. So that was really incredibly insightful to me, to look at what in fact I was disconnected from. Where had I applied this similar bull-headed kind of approach to life? Because especially when you're doing significant, martial art, those physical activities, you really go hard at it. There's no doubt. I came from a sporting family, so I played really hard, competitive sport.
And
And
New Zealand rugby, right? The All Blacks. It doesn't get any more serious than that.
Exactly. Well, in fact, in my high school, Kevin, I was in the same team as one of the All Black captain. So we had the All Black captain and the All Black fullback at that time in our school team. So we were, you can imagine, even at those ages, they were pretty, and he was the captain of our school team and I played on the wing. So we felt that, hard-headed, you trained till any hour of the day. It didn't matter. That became your, raison d'etre, your reason for being was you were going to go out there and have victory. So it was a pretty powerful motivating force. And especially when there's a whole team doing it, you kind of do whatever you're going to do for the team, which kind of brings us on to another, about talking about the team or the collective approach, is some of the spiritual meanings, not just behind our bodies, because our body has a collective wisdom that is pointing us to it. All the aches and pains are pointing out to us really important things about what is happening in our daily life and what we can learn from it. In the same way as the body has a wisdom, so our collective body or our collective planet has a wisdom. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about the spiritual meaning of COVID, about the way that the coronavirus has impacted us, and perhaps what that's showing to us collectively about tensions and disharmony on our planet.
Yeah, yeah. So I think this insight is really not to be overlooked. We so often look at physical symptoms and just treat our body like it's a machine, like it's not as an expression of consciousness. But when we look at the body as an expression of consciousness, then every physical symptom, every pain and tension in the body is expressing something, as you said, is pointing out something to us, whether it's something about our diet or something about our relationships with others or relationship to our environment or our work, whatever. And likewise, we have a collective body and a collective consciousness. And in this past year, our collective consciousness has had a big awakening, or at least a big opportunity for awakening with COVID. And I know we talked about a year ago as it was all starting, and it's like, well, what will this point out to us? What is COVID here to show us as human beings in relationship to each other and in relationship to our environment? And I know we talked back then about a couple things. One is about the opportunity to step back. Since we were kind of in this shutdown mode, we had an opportunity to step back and pause and look at our lives and say, hey, what do we need to do differently here? What is the opportunity in COVID in terms of being able to become wiser and more skillful in our relationships with each other and with the planet? And for one, we see, with COVID and the origin of COVID, how we treat other beings, how we treat animals, how we treat our environment, and then with how we interact with each other. Do we have the approach of, well, that my decisions are just about what's good for me? Or do we have the approach that every decision I make relates to everyone else? And with social distancing and with wearing masks and with getting the vaccine, do we look at it as just, well, what's good for me? Or do we look at this as an opportunity to say, well, how do our actions affect everyone else and affect the planet around us and affect our environment? So I really think we're still, we're all hoping, oh, we're almost at the end of COVID, but you know, COVID is a symptom of much bigger patterns in our consciousness, much bigger behaviors and symptoms that we really need to look into. So I'm interested in your thoughts on, the spiritual or consciousness, the meaning and consciousness of COVID for our relationships and with each other and with the environment.
Yeah, Kevin, look, you've said it so beautifully already. I do think it's intrinsically about our relationship with each other, really our relationship to love and to healing. Because quite often, when we get an ache here or a little bit of pain here or some inflammation, we don't check in with that, right? And that kind of happened in the beginning. There was those initial outbreaks and people think, oh, it's kind of isolated, it's in China, it's over here, it's over there. But really, in fact, it was trying to point out to us, look, something is happening that we need to pay attention to. Very few people ask the question, what's the earth trying to tell us, or what's our collective body of humanity trying to tell us? And of course, we've also seen, in recent times, a lot of blame, people saying, oh, it's because of this, it's because of that, it's because of something else, without actually looking really closely at what is this trying to tell us. So the wisdom of our relationship with, disharmony, I think that this is what it points right to, and all of us can start right from our families and our neighborhoods. It's very easy for us to overlook disharmony, even within just a small community, or we can so easily think that, okay, the problem's out there, the problems with our neighbor, the problems with something else, the problems with our kids, the problems with the teacher. But in fact, the disharmony really starts with us. So that's the key, making it a we consciousness, and making this looking directly into disharmony and finding where we can find love is really one of the most important things. That's what our intuition is trying to tell us. So it's really powerful lesson to consider also that it's pointing straight towards this group intuition, this collective intuition. I think, as you've said, we quite often look at it this from, how's this going to affect me? Am I going to get the vaccine? Am I not? Am I going to be okay? What about how are people treating me at work? And it's not just talking about COVID. It's talking about how we view our world, how we judge people, how we open up to our community, our family, or not. So that sort of wisdom that it's pointing to is really very crucial. We often overlook the fact that we not only have an individual intuition, but we have a collective intuition, and we don't listen to that as a group. We have really not a lot of coherence as a group. You look at the way different countries are reacting, and they're not reacting with a global intuition. They're acting all over the place. You can see with some of the challenges that are being faced by, say, for example, Brazil or India, or even in the US in different parts, that people react almost as if they're individuals. The countries seem to be acting without that collective intuitive insight. So I thought, the collective intuition, the fact that the collective body of not only each other, but the earth is incredibly intelligent, and that we should actually spend time communicating with that, and that rather than spending any money anymore on destroying things, destroying animals, destroying the planet, why aren't we learning how to communicate and really make use of this collective intuition, collective body wisdom? Because as we often talk about, Kevin, with subtle energy meditation, we are energetic beings. So our very emotions, feelings, thoughts, and beliefs are affecting our well-being. So consider that on a collective level, and our collective energies, emotions, feelings, thoughts, and beliefs are actually affecting this planet. And once we take the time to really understand what that's trying to tell us, then we don't stagnate. We don't exist in this separation. We start to really understand the power of collective coherence and collective intuition and collective wisdom, and that then guides us towards a place of harmony rather than disharmony. And that's what I think COVID has pointed out right across the world, is just how disharmonious we are. It's not we can be,
and
we
how
are.
interdependent we are.
And how
Right?
interdependent we
If
are.
there's one
Absolutely.
spiritual meaning or one spiritual pointing out of COVID and seeing how it's spread over the entire planet so quickly, is interdependence. If we learn one thing from COVID, and what an amazing result that would be, is if we really learned on a radical, fundamental level how interdependent we are. That
Absolutely.
that would change the world.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's sort of like looking at your body and saying that the pain in your foot has nothing to do with the pain in your neck. And in fact, we know that from our bodies, once we develop that body wisdom, that it's crucially interdependent, and that a pain we get around our chest might be sending some signals, or a pain we get in our arm might be sending some signals. And that's the way we could look at our world, is that the pain that we feel anywhere is our pain. It's our collective pain. And that the disharmony we feel anywhere is our collective disharmony. And that we can all work towards that in an interdependent way. So I absolutely agree with you.
Be powerful if we can, all use this time, this precious time we have, as a moment of greater awareness and recognition of interdependence, recognition of what happens physically is related to what's happening in our state of consciousness and the way we view each other and the way we view our planet. So we
Beautifully
hope
said.
that insight about the body as an expression of consciousness, and to ask whenever there's something happening physically, what's the spiritual meaning of this? What is being pointed out to us in what is happening, and how we can learn and grow from that. So thank you, Stephen, for this discussion, and I hope that you all find it inspiring and insightful, and something that you can use to reflect on your own symptoms and your state of consciousness and relationships.
Thank you, Kevin. Beautiful insights indeed.